She had been asleep for 9 years when I finally found her. I want to be clear about the word finally, because it implies I knew where I was going, which is not precisely true. I knew I was going somewhere. I had known it since the morning I was 23 years old and woke from a dream I could not remember with the absolute, wordless certainty that there was a direction in the world I was supposed to be moving in, and that I was not moving in it. I had been king of Ashenvale for 2 years at that point. My father had died in the winter. I had taken the crown with the solemnity the moment required, and the private terror of a young man who had not expected to be handed anything quite so heavy quite so soon. I had a council. I had a pack. I had a hold to govern and trade agreements to maintain and border disputes to adjudicate. And I had, every morning since the dream, the sensation of a compass needle pulling steadily northeast. I told no one for a year. Then I told my second, Bren, who had the specific quality of being unmoved by information, which made him the correct person to tell. Northeast, he said. Yes. How far northeast? I don't know, I said, far. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, the bond. I don't know what it is, I said, which was true. I had no mate. I had felt nothing of a mate bond, no mark, no pull toward any woman I had ever met. This was different, not a person pulling me but a direction, a patient and absolute orientation, the way water runs downhill not because it decides to, but because the shape of things requires it. You're going to go, Bren said. Yes. How long? I don't know, I said, as long as it takes. He had sighed in the particular way of men who have made peace with the impossible. He had taken over the governance of Ashenvale, which he was better at than I was, and I had packed what a man packs for a long road when he does not know how long the road is, and I had walked out of my own hold on a pale autumn morning and turned northeast. That was 9 years ago. I will not tell every year of the road, because this is not a story about the road, it is a story about what was at the end of it. But I will tell enough, because what I crossed matters to understanding what I found. The first year took me through the riverbend territories, small packs, isolated holds, the kind of places that are suspicious of strangers, and become less so when they discover the stranger is a king who has left his throne to walk, which is peculiar enough to be disarming. I stopped at healers' halls, not because I needed healing, but because the bond was drawing me toward something I could not name, and healers knew the names of things that resisted naming. It was at a healer's hall in the river country, at the end of the first year, that I first heard about the sleeping curse. An old healer named Cressa told me. She told it the way people tell things they have long since stopped expecting anyone to fix, not a warning, not a call for help, simply a fact of the world. There was a woman, she said, sleeping in a hold called Valedorn, 3 weeks' walk into the highland territories to the northeast. She had been sleeping for a year. Every healer in the river country had been to Valedorn. Some of them had tried moon water, bone root, the calling techniques, the reversal rites. The woman had not woken. The curse was old, Cressa said, older than the hold. It was not a made curse, not the kind that someone casts with intent and malice. It was a natural curse, the kind that grows in places of deep old magic when something goes unresolved for long enough, and Valedorn sat on one of the oldest crossings in the highland territories, a place where the moon's pull was stronger than it should be and the wolves had lived since before there were pack names. The woman who had fallen asleep there had simply fallen into the magic of the place, the way a stone falls into water, not violently, just inevitably. She was not in pain, Cressa said. The wolves slept around her. Her body was unchanged. She simply would not wake. Her name, Cressa said, was Sira. I had stood in the healer's hall with the compass in my chest pointing northeast and the word Sira in my ears, and I had felt something move in me that I could not describe then and can only partially describe now, not recognition exactly, because I had never met her. Something closer to the way a key feels when it finds the right lock, even before you turn it. a settling, an alignment. "Is anyone with her?" I asked. "An old caretaker," Cressa said. "Devon, he was her father's friend. He refuses to leave." I thanked her and walked on. The next 8 years are a passage I crossed one day at a time. I went through the highland approaches, the long switchback roads where the pine forests thin and the stone begins, where the waystations are half ruined and the packs are few and the wolves are large and old and move like weather across the ridgelines. I stopped at every healer's hall and every pack hold that would receive me. I was not hurrying. The compass was patient, and I had learned to be patient with it. At each place I stopped, I heard more about Veildorn. A healer in the second year told me about the threshold, the point, 30 yards from the hold's main gate, where visitors were turned back. Not violently, simply returned. You walked toward the gate and found yourself walking away from it, the direction reversed without any sensation of having turned. It had happened to everyone who tried to enter in the years since the curse deepened. Only old Devon, who had been inside when the curse settled, remained. A pack elder in the third year told me about the wolves, how they had gathered in the year after the curse, wolves from all the highland territories, dozens of them, moving to Veildorn with the focused purpose of animals who know where they are supposed to be. They lay in the great room of the hold, surrounding the woman who slept, and they did not fight and they did not hunger and they were simply present, standing guard. The elder did not know what they were waiting for. He thought perhaps they knew something that could not be said in words, which was, he observed, true of most things wolves know. In the 5th year I met a moon reader in a high pass who told me about the mate bond theory. She had studied the old texts, she said. The highland crossing at Veildorn had a specific quality, it responded to the mate bond. The natural curse it housed was of the kind that only a true mate's presence could resolve, because the magic of the crossing was the magic of completion, of a thing that was unfinished being finished. Sira, sleeping in the heart of that magic, was waiting. The crossing was waiting. The moon reader used the word resolved, with the particular weight of someone who means something larger than the word usually carries. I had stood in the high pass with the wind off the peaks and the compass in my chest, and I had thought, 9 years of road then. In the 6th year my mate mark appeared. It came in the night, between one moment and the next, a warmth at my wrist that was not warmth exactly but something adjacent to it, the way the air before a storm is not yet rain but is already changed. I looked at my wrist in the dark of a waystation, and there was a mark there that had not been there the morning before, small, precise, the shape of something I did not have a name for but recognized the way you recognize a voice you have not yet heard speak. I covered it, I walked on. In the 7th year, I began to see the highland holds that had sent people to Veildorn and failed. There were many of them, packs whose best healers had tried and been returned by the threshold, whose strongest wolves had pressed against the reversal and found it absolute. Some of them were still sending people yearly, with the stubborn hope of communities that have not yet made peace with a thing being permanent. Others had given up and listed Veildorn in their records as a loss. She has been called lost, I wrote in the journal I kept on the road, for 7 years by people who were not hers. She has not been found yet. That is different. In the 8th year the road turned, and for the first time in 8 years the compass was not pulling me forward but simply holding, pointing. I was close enough that the direction had resolved into a specific place rather than a general orientation, and I walked the last year knowing I was walking toward a particular door. I reached Veildorn at dawn on the last day of autumn in my 32nd year, 9 years and 1 season after I had walked out of Ashien. The hold was smaller than I had imagined and more beautiful. Stone, as all highland holds are stone, but old stone, the kind that has been standing long enough to look like it grew there rather than was built. The walls were covered in the particular gray-green moss that means centuries, not decades. The gates were iron, not locked but standing open, because there had been no one to lock them out for years, and the threshold itself was the gate that mattered. I walked toward it. At 30 yards, I felt the reversal begin, not a pressure but an inclination, a subtle wrongness in the direction of forward, the way you feel the tide pull sand from under your feet. I kept walking. The inclination increased. At 20 yards, it was a distinct resistance, the kind of thing that would have turned any person who had not been walking toward this particular door for 9 years. I kept walking. At 10 yards, the resistance was significant. My wolf, quiet for 9 years of road, patient and attending the same way the compass was patient, rose behind my ribs for the first time. Not against me, with me. He pressed forward into the threshold the way a wolf presses into cold water to ford a river, not comfortable, not deterred. The resistance held for 3 more steps. Then it didn't. I walked through the gate of Valedorn, and the resistance dissolved behind me like a breath released, and I was standing in the courtyard of an ancient highland hold in the pale light of the last day of autumn, and the wolves were already watching me. They had come to the courtyard doors, dozens of them, great highland wolves with the highland coloring of dark gray and silver, old and still and watching. They did not move toward me. They did not retreat. They simply looked, with the particular focused attention of animals who have been waiting for something and are now determining whether it has arrived. I stood still and let them look. After a moment, the largest of them, ancient, enormous, the silver of a wolf who has seen many winters, sat down. The others, one by one, followed. I have never felt so clearly assessed in my life, and I have faced councils, border disputes, and 2 separate challenges to my claim on Ashenval. The wolves of Valedorn looked at me for the length of a long breath, and then collectively decided I was what was needed, and sat. I walked inside. The great room was unchanged. That was the first thing I understood. Her life was mid-moment. The herb-drying racks along the south wall, still hung with bundles of highland thyme and dried moonflower, brittle now but still fragrant, still in the precise order of a person who organized by use rather than by alphabetization. Her record books on the long table open to entries written 9 years ago, the handwriting small and exact and slightly left tilted in the way of people who teach themselves rather than being taught. A healer's kit, laid out beside the open book as if she had been called away from it and intended to return. A chair pulled slightly back from the table. A cup, long dry. She was in the center of the room. She lay on a low stone bench that had been moved to give her more space, moved by Devon. I would learn in the first weeks, before he understood that nothing could be moved quickly in Valedorn without the wolves objecting. Around her, in their great circle, the pack slept, all of them, the entire assembled Highland Guard of Valedorn, lying around her with the patient completeness of wolves who have assigned themselves a task and intend to complete it regardless of duration. She was sleeping with the specific quality of deep and complete rest, not the stillness of illness, not the hollowness of something sustained artificially. She was simply asleep, the way someone is asleep at 3 in the morning in a warm room, unreachably present. Her hands were at her sides. Her dark hair was loose. Her face was entirely composed, the kind of composed that is native rather than acquired, the face of a person who had always looked at difficult things calmly. I stood in the doorway of the great room and looked at her, and my mate mark burned at my wrist, and my wolf pressed forward with a quiet urgency that was nothing like any urgency I had felt before, not alarm, not need, but the urgency of something that has been waiting to complete for 9 years and is now very close to completing. You got through the threshold. The voice came from the corner, an old man in a chair beside the window, a blanket over his knees, looking at me with the guarded attention of someone who has hoped for a specific thing for a long time and cannot quite believe it might be arriving. Yes, I said. He looked at me for a long time, at my wrist where the mate mark showed below my cuff, at my face. 9 years, he said. Yes. You didn't know her, he said. Not a question. The assessment of a man who has been in this room for 9 years and knows very well that no one who knew her had come through that threshold. No, I said, I didn't know her, but I've been walking toward here since I was 23. Another long look. Then the old man, Devon, I understood, nodded once, the nod of someone who has waited long enough to recognize what he was waiting for when it arrives. Sit down, he said. I'll tell you who she was. He talked for 3 days. I did not try to reach her in those 3 days. This was not patience exactly. It was more that the bond was telling me, with the same quiet clarity that had guided 9 years of road, that the approach mattered. That arriving was not the same as being ready, that there was something I needed to understand before I could be what the threshold had let through. Devon told me everything. Sierra had been her father's daughter in the way that matters most. She had his mind, his precision, his absolute inability to see suffering without doing something about it. Her father had been the Highland territory's most skilled healer, traveling between the isolated high holds with the methodical dedication of a man who understood that people in remote places have fewer options and therefore deserve more effort. She had traveled with him from childhood, learning the trade not from texts but from watching what worked and what didn't and asking why with the focused persistence of a child who did not accept "that's how it's done" as an answer. When her father died, she was 22. He was old. It was not unexpected. She had continued his work alone. She had been at Valedorn for 6 months before the curse took her, in residence to treat a persistent joint ailment in several of the elder wolves of the territory pack. It was, Devon said, entirely characteristic of her that she had come to the wolves rather than asking the wolves to come to her. The curse had come at night. Devon described it as a settling, the hold going very quiet, the wolves gathering without instruction, and then Sierra simply lying down on the bench in the middle of the great room as if she had decided to rest, and not waking. He had sent for healers immediately. He had sent for them every year since. He had, he said, never stopped believing she would wake, because Sierra herself had never been the kind of person who gave up on things, and he was not prepared to give up on her behalf. He told me about her record books, how they tracked not just treatments but outcomes and hypotheses, patterns she had noticed across a decade of highland healing work that no single healer had ever been in a position to observe before. He told me about her way with the highland wolves, which was not the way of someone who managed animals, but the way of someone who understood them as people of a different kind. He told me about her dry humor, which was the kind of dry humor that comes from paying very close attention to the gap between what people say and what they mean. By the 3rd day, I felt I knew her. This was not the same as having met her. It was something adjacent, the knowledge of a person from the evidence they have left in the world, the same way you know a river from what it has done to the banks. I slept on the floor of the great room that 3rd night, among the wolves, and I woke at dawn with my mate mark burning steadily, and the compass, 9 years of patient northeast, finally still. Not gone still. It had brought me here. It was now waiting for me to do the last thing. I crossed the circle of wolves at first light. They did not part for me exactly. They were already lying apart enough for a person to pass between them, had always been, because the circle was never a barrier, it was a guard. I moved through them slowly, and each wolf I passed lifted its head briefly to watch and then laid it back down, the acknowledgement of animals who have been waiting for this particular moment for 9 years and find they are not surprised by it now that it has come. I reached the bench. I stood beside her for a moment. The mate mark at my wrist was warm in a way that was no longer about warmth. It was a resonance, 2 things tuned to the same frequency and beginning to find each other. I could feel the curse in that proximity, not as a presence exactly, but as an absence, a held breath, the quality of a door that has been shut too long and is straining at the frame. The magic of the old crossing at Valedorn gathered into this room, into this woman, waiting for the thing it had always been waiting for. I took her hand. The curse resisted. I had been warned about this by the moon reader in the high pass, by Devon in 3 days of telling, by something in my own bones that understood the nature of a thing that has held for 9 years. The resistance was not hostile. It was simply immense, the weight of 9 years of accumulated waiting, the compressed force of all the unresolved things that a true crossing holds in solution. It pressed back against the bond the way a great stone presses against a lever, not moving, and then, when the leverage is right, moving. My wolf drove forward. Not the wolf of an animal instinct, the wolf of the bond itself, the deep self that had been walking northeast for 9 years, with the patience of something that knows what it is doing even when the man carrying it does not. It pressed into the curse with the focused steadiness of a thing that has waited long enough and is done waiting, and the mate mark at my wrist blazed, not gold exactly, not light exactly, but the color of something becoming true. Sierra's hand was warm in mine. The curse broke like ice in spring. Not dramatically, not with a sound or a flash, it simply released. The held breath quality of the room exhaled, a long, slow dissolution, and the morning light through the east windows came a little brighter, and the wolves around us, all at once, without signal, lifted their heads. She opened her eyes. They were dark, her eyes, and they were immediately awake. Not the slow surface to consciousness of normal sleep, but the immediate full presence of a person arriving, oriented, taking in the room with the precise attention of a healer who has been trained to assess a situation before reacting to it. She assessed the room, the morning light, the wolves all watching, old Devon, who was crying in his chair with the quiet relief of a man whose 9 years of vigil had just resolved. Her own hands and then mine, her hand in mine, and the mate mark at her wrist, which was there, which had not been there before, which was the same color as the one on my wrist. She looked at me. I had prepared, in 9 years of road, approximately nothing to say to her. I had thought about the road, about the threshold, about the curse, about what Devon had told me, and what I had read in her record books in 3 days of sitting beside her. I had not prepared anything to say when she opened her eyes, because there is no preparation for standing in front of the person the compass has been pointing at for 9 years, and finding that they are looking back at you with the alert, precise, slightly tilted attention of someone who is already taking you apart into comprehensible parts. "You crossed the threshold," she said. "Yes," I said. Her eyes moved to my wrist, to the mark, back to my face. "How long?" she said. 9 years, I said, 1 season. She was quiet for a moment, taking this in with the particular stillness of someone who measures things before speaking them. "You didn't know me," she said. "No. But you came anyway." "The bond knew," I said. "I just walked where it pointed." Another pause. Outside, one of the highland wolves, the great ancient silver one from the courtyard, had moved to the open doorway of the great room and was sitting there with the satisfied posture of a wolf who has completed a long assignment and is considering taking the rest of the day at ease. "Devon," she said, without looking away from me. "He's been here since the beginning," I said. "He told me everything about you." "That could be alarming," she said, "depending on what he chose to tell." "He told me about the record books," I said. "The outcomes tracking, the highland joint ailment, the thing about how you organize the herb drying by use rather than alphabetically." "That is the correct way to organize herbs," she said, with the calm precision of someone who has clearly had this argument before and won it, and is prepared to win it again. "I know," I said. "I read the record books." The slight tilt of her head assessing. "You read my record books." 3 days of them," I said. "You have very small handwriting." "Legible, though." "Extremely legible," I said. "For 9 years of sitting in the same room as you, I also felt I owed you the courtesy of understanding who you were." She looked at me for a long moment. Her hand was still in mine, the mate marks rhyming between us, the bond a warmth that was nothing like the compass and everything it had been pointing toward. 9 years, she said again, not questioning measuring the way she measured things. 9 years, I confirmed. That's a long time to walk somewhere, she said. Yes, I said, it was. Were you sure, she said, the whole time? I considered this honestly because she was the kind of person who would know if I didn't. Not sure what I would find, I said, sure I was going the right direction. She nodded. The nod of someone who has spent a decade in highland territories, where precision matters and approximate answers get people killed, and who therefore values the distinction between certainty of destination and certainty of direction. That's a reasonable basis for 9 years of walking, she said. I thought so, I said. The ancient silver wolf in the doorway made a sound, not quite a bark, not quite a sigh, the sound of a very large and somewhat self-satisfied animal who has been keeping vigil for 9 years and finds the outcome acceptable. Sierra looked at the wolf, then back at me. And something in her face that had been the careful neutrality of a person taking stock of a new situation shifted, very slightly, into something that was not quite a smile and was more than one, the expression, I would come to understand, of Sierra when she had assessed a thing thoroughly, and found it considerably better than expected. Well, she said, that's something. Yes, I said, it is. We stayed at Valedorn through the winter. This was practical. She needed time to relearn her own legs, to eat again, to bring her body back from 9 years of stillness into full use. It was also true that Valedorn needed her, and she needed Valedorn in the way of a person and a place that have spent 9 years in each other's company, even if the person was not precisely conscious for most of it. She moved through the hold in those first weeks with the methodical attention of someone taking inventory, checking what had changed, what had held, what the wolves needed, what the record books had been accumulating in the notes Devon had written in the margins in 9 years of faithful attendance. She read every marginal note. She wept briefly in private, and then she came back to the table and wrote a formal entry in the record book thanking Devon for his notes in her small, precise handwriting, and left it open where he would find it. I watched this and thought about 9 years of road. She asked me about ASHENVAL, not with the political interest of someone assessing an alliance, but with the direct curiosity of someone who wants to understand a place that shaped a person. She asked about Bren, who had been running ASHENVALE for 9 years, and what he was like, and whether he was better at it than me. I told her honestly that he probably was, which made her look at me with that slightly tilted assessment, and say that this seemed like a useful thing to know about oneself. I told her I thought so too. She asked about the road. Not the hard parts, she could infer the hard parts, but the specific things. The healers I had met, the knowledge I had gathered, the way the highland approaches changed going north to south versus south to north. She had questions about 3 of the healers I mentioned by name, colleagues of hers whose work she knew from correspondence, and she asked about them the way she had clearly been waiting to ask about them for 9 years. I answered everything I could. I had, after all, spent 9 years on the road that connected her to the wider world, and I could give her something of that world in return for the 9 years of it she had missed. The wolves of Valedorn, for their part, treated me with the specific approval of animals who have completed a difficult task and are now prepared to relax. The ancient silver one, whose name, Devon told me, was something in the old wolf tongue that roughly translated as the one who holds, slept most of the winter days on the hearthrug in the great room, in the spot closest to where Sierra sat at her record books. He had been holding for 9 years. He had, apparently, decided he could afford to be warm for a while. In the deep of winter, one evening, Sierra looked up from the record books and said, without preamble, ASHENVALE will need you back in the spring. Yes, I said. and you'll need to formally establish the alliance between Valedorn and Ashenval, she said. Given the situation. The alliance, I said. The mate bond, she said, with the calm clarity of a woman who calls things what they are. Which means Valedorn becomes part of Ashenval's territory, or they become allied territories, or some equivalent arrangement that satisfies the pack councils. I've been working through the options. She turned the record book toward me. She had written in 3 columns the political arrangements and their respective advantages and complications. The handwriting was, as always, entirely legible. I looked at the 3 columns for a moment. You've been planning the administrative structure of our mating alliance, I said. Someone had to, she said. You were busy recovering from 9 years of road. I've had 3 weeks, I said. You look tired, she said, without any particular inflection, which I understood to mean that she had noticed and had given me time accordingly, which was such a specific and characteristic act of care that I found I had nothing to say to it except to reach across the table and cover her hand with mine. She looked at our hands, the mate marks, both of them settled and warm. The second column is probably most practical, she said. I agree, I said. We'll need to go to Ashenval in the spring, she said. Yes, I said. I'll need to bring the record books, she said. Devon will want to stay, and we'll need to arrange a proper caretaker for Valedorn, and the Highland wolves will need to know what's happening. They'll have opinions. They always do, I said. The silver wolf on the hearthrug opened one eye, observed this exchange, and closed the eye again with the serene confidence of an animal who has seen how this was going to go for 9 years, and is unsurprised by any of it. The pack councils came to Valedorn in the early spring. They came because Valedorn was the site of the event, and because the event, the curse broken, the sleeping woman woken, the threshold crossed after 9 years of turning everyone back, was the kind of thing that pack councils feel they should witness formally rather than hear about second-hand. Bren came from Ashenval with 3 of the senior council, which was Bren being thorough. The Highland pack elders came from the surrounding territories, some of whom had been sending yearly delegations to try the threshold since before some of the younger delegates were born. They stood in the courtyard of Valedorn, and they watched Sira move through the hold with the deliberate competence of a woman who knows exactly where everything is and exactly what each thing means. And they watched the Highland wolves orbit her with the relaxed confidence of animals who have completed their assignment. And they watched her greet Bren with the precise courtesy of a woman who has been told a great deal about a person and is interested to verify her impressions. And they watched her look at me across the courtyard with the slightly tilted expression that I had learned, in one winter, meant she had found something considerably better than expected. The formal mating rite was conducted at midday. Devon officiated because he was the oldest adult present and because Sira had asked him, which was the kind of request that required no explanation to anyone who had been paying attention. When the words were said and the bond sealed in the old way, and the mate marks at our wrists flared briefly with the warmth of something affirmed rather than something new, the Highland pack elders bowed, not because they had been instructed to, not because the politics required it, though they did, because Sira was standing in the courtyard of Valedorn in the pale early spring light with the wolves around her, and the healer's precision in her eyes and 9 years of her holds waiting resolved at last, and because the wolf packs of the Highland territories know, at a level that precedes ceremony, when something has been completed that was supposed to be completed. Bren, who had run Ashenval for 9 years without complaint, and would continue to be better at governance than me for the foreseeable future, caught my eye across the courtyard and said nothing, which was how Bren communicated most things of significance. I nodded, he nodded back. Sira, beside me, was looking at the Highland pack elders with the expression of someone who has a great many questions about the Highland territory's medical records and is calculating the most efficient order in which to ask them. You're going to interview every one of them about the joint ailment study, I said. I've been asleep for 9 years, she said. I have a great deal of catching up to do. We have time, I said. Yes, she said, and then quietly, with the precision of a woman who does not say things she does not mean, we do. We went to Ashnvale in the late spring, when the highland roads were clear. Sierra brought the record books. She had spent the last weeks of winter making copies of the most critical entries, the ones she considered most likely to be needed quickly once she was working again. She also brought a selection of highland herbs, wrapped in the specific way she had developed for long-distance transport, and a correspondence pack that she had already filled with the first letters of what would become, over the years, the most extensive network of healer correspondence in the Wolfpack territories. She had also, quietly, arranged a new caretaker for Valedorn, a young healer from the river territories who had written to her twice in the past year, in letters forwarded via Devon, asking questions about the highland work. Sierra had read both letters with the attention she gave everything, and had written back with the directness she applied to everything. And by the time we left, the young healer had been at Valedorn for 2 weeks, and Devon had approved of her in the specific way of old men who approve of competence and directness, and people who do not treat experience as interchangeable with wisdom. Devon walked with us to the end of the Highland Road. He said nothing at the parting that was worth repeating here. What he said belonged to the two of them, and Sierra received it in the particular quiet of a person who knows the weight of a thing and is not going to diminish it by performing a feeling she already has. She embraced him. He stood a little straighter afterward, the way old men stand when something they have been responsible for is finally, fully, safely resolved. The silver wolf walked with us to the threshold. At the threshold, the same threshold that had returned everyone who tried to enter for 9 years, which now dissolved around us with the faint warmth of something that had finished its work, he stopped. He sat. He looked at us both, in the calm, unhurried way of a very old wolf who has completed the most important task of his long life and is ready to rest. I had the sense, looking at him, that we were being seen off, that the vigil was over, formally and completely, and the wolf who had held it was now releasing us with the specific satisfaction of someone who did their part correctly. Sierra crouched briefly and pressed her hand to the top of his great silver head. He accepted it with the dignity of a king receiving a gesture he was entirely prepared for. Then we walked out through the threshold and the Highland Road opened before us, and Valedorn was behind us, and Ashnvale was ahead, and the compass that had pulled me northeast for 9 years was finally, completely, perfectly still. Not absent, not resolved into nothing, still the way something is still when it has arrived. I had been walking toward her since I was 23 years old. I had not known her name, or her face, or the exact tilt of her head when she was assessing something. I had not known about the record books, or the way she organized the herbs, or the dry humor that emerged in the gap between what was expected and what was actually true. I had known the direction, the bond had known the rest. She walked beside me on the Highland Road in the late spring morning, the record books in her pack, the first correspondence already begun, the mate mark warm at her wrist, asking me about the specific road conditions of the passes we were going to cross, and whether I had found the northern switchbacks to be faster or the valley approaches, because she was going to need to travel them regularly, and she preferred to plan efficiently. I told her everything I knew about the road. It took most of the morning, and by the time we reached the first pass, she had asked 17 clarifying questions and made 3 additions to her correspondence pack, and observed that the valley approaches sounded more practical for supply transport even if the switchbacks were faster for a single traveler, which was correct. 9 years of road, and at the end of it, a woman asking exactly the right questions about it. That is what the compass had known.